Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The rain fell relentlessly on Chicago that evening, transforming the streets into shimmering rivers beneath the streetlights. James Walker, a U.S. Army veteran, walked slowly, leaning on his cane. His 68 years hadn't dulled his spirit, but the weariness of years of service was etched on his weathered face. Each step echoed on the sidewalk, but he didn't want to go home before enjoying one last hot meal at his favorite diner, Sunnyside. James was a man who had seen war firsthand, who had risked his life to protect his country and his fellow citizens. Yet, he was unaware that he was about to face a much more subtle and painful battle, everyday racism, the kind that strikes at your heart without warning. Inside the diner, the light was warm, the smell of coffee and pancakes wafted through the air. But behind the counter, Tyler Grant, a young employee with a hard stare and a narrow mind, swept across the tables with an expression of contempt. His prejudices, inherited from an ignorance he had never questioned, were about to be exposed. James pushed open the door. The chime rang softly, and the few customers present looked up, intrigued but silent. He walked towards the counter, a polite smile on his lips, unaware that this simple gesture of wanting to order a coffee would unleash a storm of injustice and suppressed anger. Young Tyler, barely older than James's son, stared at him with cold eyes. The moment seemed to stretch, heavy with tension. A minute passed, then two. The oppressive silence was finally broken by Tyler. "Sorry, sir. I can't serve you." Those words, simple yet sharp as a blade, sent a shiver down James's spine. He felt his anger rise, but also his resilience. He straightened, his gaze calm but unwavering. After all, he had faced far more dangerous enemies on distant battlefields. What he didn't yet know was that this refusal would trigger a chain of events that would not only change his day, but the lives of everyone present at that dinner. Because sometimes, the real battles aren't fought with weapons, but with courage, dignity, and the will to fight for what is right. James Walker entered the Sunnyside diner, his coat soaked by the rain, his shoes leaving small watermarks on the shiny tiles. The warm aroma of freshly ground coffee and caramelized pancakes greeted him, but it wasn't enough to soothe the knot forming in his stomach. After years of serving his country, he had expected a simple, quiet meal. But he didn't yet know that this day would be anything but ordinary. Behind the counter stood Tyler Grant, a young man with neatly combed blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. Tyler mechanically swept crumbs from a table, occasionally casting a cold glance at James. The atmosphere immediately became heavy. James stepped forward, his chin slightly raised, trying to hide his fatigue. "Good evening," he said in a firm but polite voice. "A black coffee and, perhaps a scrambled egg, please." Tyler stared at him, his blue eyes hardening. A moment of hesitation crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by an icy expression. "Sorry, sir. I can't serve you," he said curtly. James froze, surprised. The sound of those words, simple but humiliating, resonated like a thunderclap in the diner. "Excuse me," repeated James, his voice calm but full of disbelief. I can't serve you," Tyler insisted, looking away, avoiding James's eyes. James felt a surge of anger rising, but he took a deep breath. He knew the value of control, the discipline earned on the battlefield. He leaned slightly towards the counter, his voice still calm but firmer. "I am a veteran. I served this country. What exactly is the reason for refusing me service?" Tyler stammered, unable to formulate a response. The silence in the diner became almost oppressive. The customers present watched the scene, some averting their eyes, others whispering amongst themselves. Suddenly, a female voice broke the tension. "This is unacceptable," exclaimed Sarah Mitchell, a businesswoman sitting by the window. She stood up, her eyes blazing with anger. "Do you realize that this man risked his life for your country?" Tyler stepped back slightly, embarrassed, as other customers began to murmur, occasionally pulling out their phones to film the scene. James sensed that the moment had gone beyond a simple confrontation. It had become a matter of dignity, and he couldn't afford to back down. A young waitress, Lisa Hernandez, approached James, hesitant but compassionate. "I'm sorry for what he did to you," she murmured. "If you like, I can call the landlord." James nodded. He knew that this battle would not be won through anger, but through justice. "Very well," he said, "I will call someone to sort this out." Tyler paled and stepped back a little further, sensing that the situation was slipping completely out of his control. The diner, usually warm and quiet, had become the scene of a silent but intense confrontation. And for James, this was only the beginning of a long ordeal. The Sunnyside diner was now silent, except for the murmurs of the customers and the clinking of cups and cutlery. Every glance seemed to weigh on James Walker like an added burden, but he stood straight, his face calm, breathing slowly to contain the anger that boiled inside him. Tyler Grant, for his part, stood behind the counter, his face red and his hands trembling. The injustice he had just committed was beginning to catch up with him. The tension in his shoulders betrayed his nervousness. "This is unacceptable," Sarah Mitchell repeated, jumping up from her table by the window. She approached the counter, her heels clicking on the tiles. "Do you realize that this man risked his life for your country?" The words hit Tyler like a whip. His blue eyes cracked with uncertainty. He opened his mouth, searching for an excuse, but no sound came out. I didn't know," he murmured, his cheeks burning. "You didn't know?" Sarah exclaimed, her voice trembling with anger. "You're supposed to serve all customers with respect, regardless of their skin color." At that moment, Lisa Hernandez, the compassionate waitress, gently approached James. "Mr. Walker," she said, lowering her voice, "I can call the landlord to sort this out. He doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior." James nodded gratefully. His face remained impassive, but inside, a storm of emotions raged: anger, humiliation, but also determination. He knew that giving in to violence or insults would only fuel the injustice. "Let's do this calmly," he murmured to Lisa, his tone firm but calm. "It's time someone intervened." Meanwhile, the customers murmured, some taking out their phones to film the scene. The atmosphere was electric, and James felt that every glance directed at him carried a mixture of fear, curiosity, and condemnation of Tyler's behavior. A few minutes later, the owner of the diner, Richard Thompson, arrived. An imposing man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a serious look, he immediately assessed the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm. Lisa calmly explained Tyler's refusal to do the service. Richard stared at the young man, whose nervousness was now obvious. "Tyler Grant," Richard said sharply, "you are dismissed, immediately. This kind of behavior has no place here." Tyler lowered his head, unable to protest. The humiliation he had inflicted on James was now turning against him. The diner, which had been the stage for his arrogance, was becoming the mirror of his mistake. James, though relieved, still felt the bitterness of the injustice. He knew this victory was small compared to the larger struggle against systemic racism. But he also felt strengthened, ready to defend his own dignity and that of others. "Thank you," he said softly to Richard and Lisa. "It's more than just a coffee you're offering me. It's respect, and that's what matters." As James finally sat down at a table, the murmurs of the other customers turned into lively discussions about injustice and courage. And at that precise moment, he knew that this day, which had begun with rain and humiliation, would mark the start of a lesson that many would not forget. A few minutes later, the Sunnyside diner was enveloped in a tense calm. James Walker sat at a table by the window, his hands resting on the cold surface, his eyes fixed on the rain streaming down the glass. Despite the difficult situation, his mind remained clear. He wasn't there to seek revenge through anger, but to ensure that justice was served. Lisa Hernandez, the compassionate young waitress, approached with a tray of coffee and a croissant. "Here's something for you," she said gently. "You should eat something, Mr. Walker. You need it after this confrontation." James gave her a faint smile. "Thank you, Lisa. But it's not just about me. It's about everyone who suffers injustices like this every day. Meanwhile, Tyler Grant stood by the door, his face pale, watching James with a mixture of shame and fear. He knew his career had just been over in an instant. Richard Thompson, the owner, had already reprimanded him and fired him on the spot. "I don't understand," Tyler murmured, almost to himself. "I was just following my feelings." "Your feelings don't give you the right to humiliate someone because of their skin color," Richard interrupted firmly. "You'll have to answer for this and think about your actions." James felt it was time to speak, but not to shout. He stood up and approached Tyler calmly, without anger in his eyes. "I am not your enemy, young man," James said in a gentle but authoritative voice. "You have made a grave mistake, but you still have a chance to change. Understand that what you did could have hurt someone more than you can imagine." Tyler looked away, unable to meet the veteran's gaze. I'm sorry," he murmured. I didn't mean." "Apologies are a start, but actions must follow," James continued. "Learn to respect others. It's the only way to repair what you've broken." Sarah Mitchell, who witnessed the scene, nodded her head in approval. "He's right, Tyler. Respecting others is more important than any prejudice or fear." Richard then intervened. "Tyler, before you even think about returning to another job, you'll need to take diversity and inclusion training. And you'll need to understand that no one deserves to be humiliated because of the color of their skin." Tyler remained silent, aware that his life had just changed in a fraction of a second. The diner, which had been the site of his arrogance, was now a place of learning and awareness. James returned to his table, took a sip of coffee, and looked at the customers around him. Many were murmuring amongst themselves, discussing what they had just seen. He realized that sometimes, true victory lies not in direct confrontation, but in how one makes their voice heard and inspires change. As the rain continued to fall outside, James thought that this moment would remain etched in his memory and in the memories of everyone present. A battle had been won, not by force, but by dignity, patience, and quiet justice. A few days after the incident, the Sunnyside diner was no longer quite the same. News of what had happened spread quickly on social media. Video filmed by some customers showed Tyler Grant refusing to serve James Walker, and it sparked outrage, debate, and massive support for the veteran. James, despite his initial reluctance to seek public attention, agreed to give an interview to convey a message that went beyond his own experience. "It's not just about me," he explained to the camera. "It's about respecting every person, regardless of their skin color, age, or background. Everyone deserves dignity and equality." Richard Thompson, the owner, also made a public statement. "Sunnyside will now be a space where all customers are treated with respect. No employee will be allowed to act otherwise, and those who break this rule will be immediately disciplined." Tyler Grant, for his part, had to complete mandatory diversity and inclusion training before he could even consider a similar job. The humiliation he had inflicted on James would not be forgotten, but it became a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions. In the diner, Lisa Hernandez continued to serve customers with a genuine smile, and every gesture of respect towards James and the other customers testified that change was possible. James, sitting at his usual table, watched the rain fall on Chicago. He felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and pride. Relief because justice had been served, sadness because this injustice still existed in the world, and pride because he had faced the humiliation with dignity. As he finished his coffee, he murmured to himself, "True strength lies not in confrontation, but in how we get back up and inspire change around us." That day, James Walker understood that every act of courage, even a silent one, could transform the lives of others. His experience at the Sunnyside was not simply a story of racism or humiliation, it was a lesson in the power of dignity, respect, and justice. And for Tyler, this lesson, though harsh, would be a permanent reminder that choosing ignorance and prejudice never leads to anything good. Dinner returned to calm, but the memory of this incident remained etched, not as a moment of shame, but as a moral and human victory.